The Society for Vascular Surgery has recently decided to sponsor a series of audiovisual interviews of the leaders whose contributions have led to the evolution of vascular surgery to its recognized current status. A committee was formed called the History Work Group Project to undertake this project. The committee was chaired by Dr. Jimmy Yao, with Norman Rich and me as members. Cal Ernst served as consultant. Younger members have been added to this committee, including Bill Baker, Mark Eskandari, Melina Kibbe, Peter Lawrence, and Walter McCarthy. Recently, Bill Pierce has been added. My name is Roger Gregory, and today we will be interviewing the Master Cardiovascular Surgeon, Dr. Jimmy Howell. Jimmy?
Hello, Roger.
Thank you for agreeing to this interview. Let's start with your early years, early days. You were born in Winfield,
Louisiana.
Louisiana.
Yes.
And tell us a little bit about your mother and father.
Well, my mother and father were good people, and we were I was raised in the country. My father, in the younger years, he had various jobs, but early recollection was that he worked in the oil patch, the oil business, drilled oil wells for a living. My mother was a housekeeper.
But a tremendous influence on you.
Yes, always.
More of an influence than your father, perhaps.
Yes. The part of his life was he was a rancher at one point in time, ran a ranch, Hereford cattle, for an old man out of Shreveport, Louisiana. It was in the piney woods, so the cattle didn't do very well in that part of the world.
Now, when did you move to Texas?
Well, we moved to Texas in 1941, beginning of World War II, from the industry. At that time, as you know, the war began, and it was a need for workers all over the world, all over the country, to build battleships, destroyers, tanks, guns, whatever. And we moved to Orange, Texas, which was a shipbuilding place. And they built LSTs and destroyers. And they produced a great number of destroyers during that early part of the World War. This later become continued to be a shipbuilding business, but they turned it into a offshore building boat facility. But during the war, this was the primary occupation. My father was building ships in a Consolidated Steel Corporation.
Jimmy, tell us about grammar school and high school, and where you went, and did you go to private school or public school?
No, I went public school.
And where was grammar school and high school?
Well, it was grammar school was in Atlanta, Louisiana, which is a sort of a small town outside of Winfield, Louisiana, which was a small town too, but it was in the country, and it was a grade school and a high school also. But I went there until I was in the 7th grade, and about that time is when the war started, and we moved to Orange, Texas. And from there I went to a grade school called Anderson Grade School in Orange, Texas. And then completed my schooling at Orange High School.
Now, what were you thinking about then? Were you thinking about med school, or were you thinking about being a cowboy, or oil, or what were you thinking about?
No, I was thinking about hunting and fishing.
You went to college at Lamar Technical Institute.
Yeah, right.
What was that about?
Well, when I got out of college, high school, you had to make a decision of what you wanted to do in life. And the decision was where you wanted to go out and go to work in some other industry or whether you wanted to pursue further education and go to college. And my mother wanted me to go to college, so that's what I did. I applied to Lamar College, which was about 25 or 30 miles from Orange.
Okay.
So I could commute back and forth to college.
But you still found time to run track.
Yeah, I did.
You did. What was that you ran? The 400?
No, I ran the 100 yards, low hurdles, and the 220 highs. 110 lows and 220 highs.
Both of which were considered suicide races, right?
Yeah, they were pretty bad on your knees. If you clipped those things, it gave you a bum knee for a while.
Now, when did you develop an interest in going to medical school?
Actually, my first year there, I met a couple of fellows. A fellow named Floyd Pollard and a gentleman by the name of C.W. Drawhorn, and both were war veterans. They're out of the service and came back to school, and we got to know each other pretty well, and they both decided they wanted to study medicine. So I had, of course, the usual studies that you would have introductory to college, but got to know them, and I said, over conversations, one thing or the other, I said, well, maybe I might want to do that. May want to study medicine. So we got to studying together and got to be great friends, and we'd study and drink a little bit at night up to midnight at 2 o'clock in the morning, and studies went pretty good. We all made pretty good grades, and so that was my college. Now, when I started to the college, the Lamar was a junior college, and I made 2 years, 2 summers, but the second year it turned into a senior college. So I did 1 more year and 1 more summer, and I was granted given an application to go to medical school, and I chose Baylor, and they accepted me.
Now, was this going to the big city?
Big city.
In medical school, you decided on surgery. How did that come to
Well, it didn't evolve very quickly. I did my medical school here, started in Baylor in 1953. And when I started, the only thing here was the Cullen Medical School building, the Herman Hospital, and they had begun to build the Methodist Hospital, early phases. And the teaching hospital we had at that time, DeBakey came here, and I guess he was granted a professorship here, chief of surgery. In 1948, I think he decided to be the chairman. And he, of course, at the time that he came, Jefferson Davis Hospital was not affiliated with the university, Baylor University, but his goal was to establish teaching programs, and the first was the Veterans Administration Hospital. He had quite an influence with the military, yes, as you know, and it was the Veterans Hospital at that time was a Navy hospital, and he got Congress, and they made it an Army hospital. And he got it as a teaching hospital affiliated with Baylor, certified. Jefferson Davis was a hospital, and they wanted to have their own residency program, but they never could qualify for certification. And he, with his political influence, was able to have Jefferson Davis Hospital become one of the teaching hospitals of Baylor. So that was a teaching hospital for Baylor when I first started my residency. Now, later it was torn down, and is now, as you know, the Ben Taub Hospital. Ben Taub was a philanthropist here, and he and DeBakey were good friends, and he and DeBakey used to come to the Jefferson Davis Hospital and make rounds with us every Sunday. This went along for a long period of time. The hospital become a little bit antiquated, and rather than try to repair it, it was space here in the medical center for another hospital, so they formed and founded the Ben Taub Hospital, which is a charity teaching hospital now, which is affiliated with Baylor. And so this was a situation, and I began my residency at the Jefferson Davis Hospital, and I had a rotating internship. I decided that I wanted to sort of decide about all the specialties. So, as you know, in a rotating internship, you have the ENT, ophthalmology, OB-GYN, medicine, whatever. And of course, DeBakey, during my tenure and becoming an intern there, he began his exploits with medicine, surgery here in Houston, and it was a fast-moving affair. Mm-hmm. And everything was moving rapidly, and all these new procedures were coming that nobody had ever heard of before. It was ability to take out an aneurysm and place a homograft in the abdominal aorta. And when I was a resident, I needed money to subsist on, and so they hired me as an assistant to the Harris County pathologist. And one of my jobs there was not a job, but it was what I did was take human aortas and ship them over here to DeBakey, and they'd cryo-freeze them and preserve them, and they used them to replace the abdominal aorta. And that was the first of the techniques that were used, were the experimental types of things that we used to replace the abdominal aorta for an aneurysm. So I became interested in this deal because it looked like to me this was a swift-moving guy, and there was a lot of things going fast, and it looked like a good frontier. So there's my deal. And so when I finished my internship at Jefferson Davis Hospital, he hired me, the department hired me as a resident in surgery, general surgery.
Now, you finished your general surgery residency in '62, then took a year in thoracic training.
Yeah, at that time, the general surgery training was 4 years,
right,
and the thoracic training was an additional year. And they had no vascular surgery training program at the time, which was later developed.
Now, you were never called to go in the military.
Well, you know, I was classified as A1, I guess, which means that you're eligible to go anytime. And I was working with DeBakey at the time, and I don't know what that deal was, but he sort of felt like that I needed to stay with the department and teach and help him, and so therefore I was disqualified from the military.
You then elected to stay at Baylor at Methodist for practice. Why did you stay? Why did you decide to stay?
Well, Roger, number one, I found this was a fast-moving community for as progressive medicine. I mean, things were happening very fast. It was a great opportunity it was growing. Industry was big here, it was growing. Everything was moving fast. I finished my training here with Cooley. He taught me cardiac and congenital heart surgery. As you know, Dr. DeBakey had given him that slot to do most of the cardiac surgery here, practically all of it. It was his slot, and he pioneered, you know, the beginnings of oxygenated blood to operate the children, and I witnessed all this as the time went along, and I was his resident on my 5th year, finishing up, and I needed a job. I had at that time, I think I had 5 children, going on maybe 6, So hell, I need some money, you know, and I need to work. And so I asked Cooley about 2 months, month or so before I got ready to graduate, because he was busy as hell. And I mean, we did the first of the valves here. He and I did the first artificial valves here in Houston, and he had a real thing going here. Old Becky did also, but at that time he didn't need the help. He wasn't overburdened, but with help. But anyway, he didn't need it at the time, and so I said, well, he said, well, why don't you go back to Orange and go and practice? And I said, well, I don't think I want to go back to Orange, because I've gotten used to this business here, what y'all have taught me, and I think I want to continue doing this. And so about 2 or 3 weeks before I got ready to graduate, well, Stanley Crawford came over and said, Dr. Becky wants you to go to work for him. I said, he does? He said, yeah. He said, when do you want me to go to work? He said, July the 1st. I said, you got a deal.
By 1975, you'd become a full professor.
Yeah.
This was a fast-moving event.
Why is that?
So, well, from the time that you finished your residency in 63,
Yeah.
by 75, you were full professor. That's moving very quickly.
Yeah, it's moving along pretty good, I guess.
Your accomplishments and honors are multiple, including a member of every prestigious surgical society in the United States. You were AOA, and recently received a Lifetime Achievement Award, both from the DeBakey Society, but also from Baylor and Methodist.
Yeah, I did.
Both of which I'm sure you were proud of.
Yes.
In addition, not mentioned very often, but in 1991, you were actually the director of vascular surgery.
Yeah,
the training
I
program.
took over that position from Stanley Crawford. Stanley had a stroke, and Stanley was ran the program from his inception. As a matter of fact, we were talking about forming this society, and he said, "Don't you think we ought to do this, because, it's going to be a up and coming thing, and we're going to make one of these days. It's going to be a boarded thing, a society that you need credentials for." And the ground roots was rumbling about it, so I said, yeah, well, let's do it. So he became the program director, and when Stanley had his stroke, I took his job as director of vascular surgery here.
Jimmy, with all these obvious successes and honors, did you experience any failures or disappointments?
Well, Roger, I can't. I don't know any. I don't recollect any real failures that I can account for, and no disappointments. It's been very good.
And let's go back to when you started here in the surgery program. You were in the middle of this explosion that was happening in Houston.
Yeah.
Suddenly,
Yeah.
grafts were available. Instruments were available.
Yeah.
The courage to do new things
Yes.
was available.
Yes.
It happened all at once.
Well, it came pretty quickly. It exploded. Yeah.
Every day, some new first was being done. Obviously, a golden time in cardiovascular surgery.
Yes.
What was this like to be involved in?
Well, it was
And all that.
an exhilarating experience. I mean, at that time, unfortunately, there was no RIBs, and so if you had a good operation, a good plan, you maybe did it on some dogs to see if it'd work. If it seemed to work, you could apply it to human beings, and generally, 99.999% of the time it worked, what you planned. And so this was the evolution, the starting of multiple progressive situation in both cardiac and vascular surgery, which had never been before.
No.
You know, I mean, it was just a stalemate. Nobody wanted to touch the heart, and nobody knew how to operate the vessels. So it was a new frontier that come into explosion just at one time, and it was just so much of it that you couldn't take care of it.
Let's talk for a moment about some of the participants in this explosive era,
Yes,
the stars in this era.
yes,
Dr. DeBakey,
yes,
Dr. Cooley,
yes,
Stanley Crawford,
yes,
George Morris,
yes,
Dr. Creech,
yes, yeah.
Ed Garrett. Could you comment on some of these stars?
The comments I have to make about him, you know, DeBakey, of course, was a student of Alton Oxness,
Right.
New Orleans, Louisiana, a bright fella. Obviously, from his beginnings, he studied hard, worked hard, accomplished a great deal in his studies in medical school, residency, and went to the Army and was a lieutenant or lieutenant colonel. I can't remember just what.
Lieutenant Colonel.
A lieutenant colonel, I believe. And he developed during the war a method of treating the injured, and that was prior to his advances in teachings. They had to take these wounded soldiers from the front lines back into hospitals, and it was a long trip. And what he recommended was they move the facilities to the front lines so that the doctors could be there on the front lines and treat these injured soldiers as they were wounded. That revolutionized medicine in the Army, which is Norman Rich can tell you all about.
Right.
But anyhow, that was a revolutionary product of his. And during the war, he came back and went back to New Orleans. And there was probably other avenues for him existed, and they invited him to come to Houston for the professor of surgery of a newly admitted medical school here, not newly, but it was a medical school developing, Baylor. And DeBakey came and accepted the position, I think, in 1948, and stayed here till his death. But he was a revolutionized surgery, as all accounts that you can know about. He was my professor, a friend of mine. Cooley was hired by DeBakey. He was a Hopkins guy, Hopkins graduate. And Cooley was with Blaylock in training when the first of the Blue Baby operations was done. And Cooley was an assistant, although about a fifth at the time at the end of the table. But anyway, he was there when Blaylock did the Blaylock Taussig shunt. And he later went to England after graduating from Hopkins and studied with Brock, Sir Russell Brock. And he was at the time one of the pioneers in heart surgery, congenital heart surgery. And so he studied with him and then came back to the United States. And after he came back here, DeBakey hired him as a professor of surgery. So introduced Cooley to this institution, which he's been all of his life in Houston, a pioneer heart surgeon. After Cooley, things were growing and getting better, bigger, and they needed more talent. And they bought it. They found this fellow by the name of Crawford, Massachusetts, Harvard. Crawford was a country boy from Alabama, Greenwood, Alabama. But he was as smart as a whip and very good technical surgeon. And so DeBakey hired him, and he was another choice. and for the department, and he stayed here until his death in the department. And then later came Morris, who was a trainee, actually, of DeBakey's.
Right.
And so DeBakey, he seemed to have a good reputation and good hands and good intellect. So DeBakey hired him to be a part of the surgery. He was a professor of surgery. Now Oscar Creech was before their time. Oscar, when he was here, he was a chief of surgery at the Veterans Hospital. And Oscar Creech and DeBakey invented the re-entry procedure for dissecting abdominal thoracic aortic aneurysms. And Oscar was a real innovator, a super nice man, and an excellent teacher. And of course, you know, they don't stay around long if somebody wants them, because they're good material for anybody and anyone. And so Tulane hired him as their chief of surgery, New Orleans. And after he went there, he was chief of surgery for a very short period of time and developed lymphoma and died. So that was his exit from the world. But he was also an innovator in this surgery. So basically all these people we've had have been really very solid, very strong, very pioneering people.
Comment on the great Ed Garrett. I know he was a close friend of yours.
DeBakey had hired Ed. You know, I just tell you the truth, you know, these fellows that work with DeBakey, you know, after a while, they was, you know, aggressive, hard-pushing people. They developed their own practices, and they had huge practices, and they were sort of helping DeBakey and doing a lot of his work, and like anybody else, you know, they might want to do a little more of their work, and so they always wanted some new man to come and take the pressure off of them a little bit. So Garrett was one of the first that they hired. That let Crawford sort of slide a little bit over to the side, and Garrett took his place, you know, daily operations of the Department of Surgery. And then the next year, after Garrett, they hired me, and to help carry the load. And at the time DeBakey hired me, you know, as regards having a real cardiac surgeon in his slots, none of the boys were really trained that well to do cardiac. And Cooley had trained me pretty good, and DeBakey wanted me to help him develop a cardiac center, which I was happy to do. And so thus I was become a member of the group.
Now, in some of the operations that you were involved in, one of the most famous involved the Duke of Windsor's operation.
Yes, we operated the Duke.
Can you comment on that operation for us, Jimmy?
Well, you know, at that period in time, DeBakey had become a world phenomenon. I mean, he was could do vascular surgery, world renowned, and so his talents weren't shadowed by anything. It was obvious all over the world that he was the best in the vascular surgery business. And of course, the Duke developed this little aneurysm, and of course, royalty would want to have the best in the world to do his operation, so he came to DeBakey, he and the Duchess, and he was a little frail fella. And he had an aneurysm about 4.5 centimeters to 5 centimeters in size, maybe, and DeBakey operated him. I was assisted with his operation on the Duke. And of course, got a little royal blood spilled on my hands, you know. But anyway, it was really an affair, you know. I mean, he didn't talk much, a little bit.
Someone else did the talking for him.
Yeah, his wife did most all the talking, as a matter of fact. She's a very stout woman, you know, and she had everything designed and planned, and almost all of his speeches and all of his interviews and whatever when he was here and meetings. And of course, I saw him every day because we'd make rounds, you know, and visit with him and make sure his wounds were all right and check him. And I got to know him a little bit, just casually, when he was in the hospital here, and that's about it. But that was the story with the Duke.
A significant piece of history.
Yeah.
Now, during this time, you were involved with a large number of significant publications and reported some of the early work on distal bypass of the lower extremities. But also, I think it's well acknowledged now that you and Ed Garrett did the first coronary artery bypass.
Yes.
Talk about the early clinical research you did on this project, and tell us about this time that was so exciting.
Well, you know, Roger, you're correct. You know, we learned that the saphenous vein, which is a superficial vein in the lower extremity, was an excellent conduit for bypassing areas of blockage by taking this vein out and reversing it, so the flow went with the valves, not against the valve, but with the valves. It made a very nice conduit, and we were able to operate on distal tibial arteries, those that were beyond repair previously. They'd come to an amputation. And Ed and I got studying some of these, and we figured that maybe one of these grafts would reach, you know, and work to one of these small vessels, which is, you know, in the shank, the artery goes into three branches: anterior, posterior tibial, and perineal. And the anterior tibial and the perineal and the posterior tibial was accessible at the ankle, or just above the ankle, or maybe even further up. But we figured that maybe in some of these people that were going to lose their legs, maybe we could make a bypass to one of those smaller vessels. So the first ones we did, Ed Garrett did it, and it was to the posterior tibial artery, and it worked, and it was a success. And then I had a judge, who was chief counsel of Humble Oil Corporation, John Q. Weatherly, and he was a patient of the Bakey's, and he had diabetes and had a gangrene, beginning gangrene of his toe, great toe, and we did arteriograms on him, and everything was blocked. The only thing he had was an anterior tibial artery in the dorsum of his foot that went back up about halfway up his shank. And the Becky did a sympathectomy on him, which is a nerve-cutting operation, as you know, and was supposed to make the vessels dilate. And he had to go to Europe, and so he left me, and of course Garrett and I were in charge of his patients when he left. And this fellow, rather than getting better, turned gangrenous, and he wanted me to, if there's anything I could do. And we got to looking at it, and I said, well, I'm not sure, but we'd done this posterior tibial, but I didn't know exactly how to make a graft go to the anterior tibial, and when it flexed, it wouldn't kink. And I said, well, maybe we could figure this out, you know. And so I said, well, this is sort of an experimental deal. Do you want to do it, or do you want to cut your foot off? And what would you say? Yeah, I want to do it. Of course, he wanted to do it. So this operation I designed as I went along with it, and it was the anterior tibial operation as I know done in the world. And this did it to his anterior tibial artery, and it worked. It worked, and I designed how to put it to the lateral part of his leg and go to the anterior tibial without it kinking, and it was really something. And the old man, he had a little opening of the distal part of the wound there above the graft, which I tended to until he healed up. and after he was a shooter, he liked to shoot skeet and trap, and he wanted me to shoot skeet with him, and so I said, well, okay. So anyway, make a long story short, after I discharged from the hospital, he gave me a brand new Buick sports automobile and 3 grade shotguns. Long story short.
Well, talk to us about the first coronary bypass.
Well, that came along later on, but the fact is, on that situation, there was always, in my mind, and of course a lot of other people's mind in this country, something for coronary disease, because there really was not anything that we had to do. Weinberg, as you know, made this operation, which is tunneled, and it took a while to make some collaterals, and some of them worked and some of them didn't. But we needed a direct approach to the coronary arteries, something that you could put blood supply right away. And with looking at these small vessel bypasses we had done, we figured that, well, why wouldn't that work on the heart? Of course, at that time, you know, the heart-lung machine had come into being, and it was a situation that you could sustain the heart. If you put it on bypass, you could sustain the heart while you're working on it. You didn't have to make it go to complete arrest, but you could sustain it and work on these small arteries even though it was beating. It may not beat fast and it would beat slow, but you could manage to look at them. And so there's a cardiologist here at the time at work he was a chair of the medicine, and a cardiologist by the name of Ed Dennis. And Ed took care of most of all the Becky's patients, and discussions with Ed thought that this might work, and Ed would give us some of these dying patients from the coronary care unit that had infarcted to operate on, to see if we could manage this, to make a bypass on these vessels. And of course you could, but these patients were dead practically when you operated on them, because they weren't going to give you anything that was alive. You know, it had to be almost pronounced dead before you got it. So none of these patients lived. And then we went to, of course, we were doing some Weinberg operations too. But then we decided that maybe the Weinberg is good because you could plant it in the anterior part of the heart with anterior descending artery. But nothing was ever recognized as far as by doing anything for the posterior wall, for the circumflex of the distal right. So we decided to take some of these veins, plug them into the descending thoracic aorta, and do like a Weinberg, make a tunnel. And we did, I think, maybe 15 patients or so, and we studied them at 3 months intervals, and we found one that was patent. That's all. So that quickly dissipated into nothing. Went back, and we did a lot of with the bypass. We could do some direct endarterectomies and patches. We started doing some of those, and some of them worked pretty well. You know, you get a distal right, you could on the pump, you could clamp on both sides, open the artery up, take the plaque out, put a little patch on. And then at about the same time, we started doing endarterectomies. We started doing what we call some gas endarterectomies, and we'd take CO2, and with a patient on the pump, and we'd just stick this artery with a 25 gauge needle, and the CO2 would go in that artery and it just go distally, and you open the artery up and pull that core out like a tree out of when it came out. Well, we studied some of those patients too, and it seemed like that the trunk could be open, but they didn't have any bed, so you hadn't done a lot, for the patient. You had an open artery, but didn't feed anything because all the branches were clogged up. So anyway, make a long story short, we had a patient, and Ed Dennis decided that he was going to give us some live patients, and so he gave us one, and it was a Mexican fellow, vascular path. Was having a lot of problems and angina. We studied him, and he had a total right coronary obstruction and an obstruction of his left main and proximal anterior and his coronary artery. He had a plaque in his anterior descending. And we sort of intended maybe to do an endarterectomy of that, and got in looking at it, and it was really not suitable for endarterectomy because of the extent of it. So we decided to try a bypass on this guy. It did, and we did it together, and we made this graft, put it to the aorta, made intraoperative pictures of it. It was patent. It looked good for us because at the time we were using these miniature plates to try to make pictures in the operating room, and it was not quite satisfactory, but at least you could see what was maybe going on with the graft. And this artery was open. We took the patient that afternoon making rounds, and he had ST segment changes, anterior wall infarct. So that sort of put a damper on us because here was the first one, we thought we might really do a good operation on and infarcted him. So it sort of placed our perspectives back to other types of things, which was the endarterectomies. But make a long story short, at this interval of time, this fellow Favillaro at the Cleveland Clinic was also studying bypass surgeries. And he did one, I believe it was we did this one in 1964, and I think Rene Favillaro did his in 1967, I believe, if I'm correct. And this graft worked, and he publicized it. And so Garrett and I went back to the drawing board, and we started doing the operation here. It become very successful. Single vessel bypasses, got to where we could do it with double vessel bypasses, and triple vessel bypasses, how many bypasses you wanted to do. So that was sort of my history of coronary artery bypass surgery and how it evolved. And of course, the Cleveland Clinic advertised that they were the first one to do surgery successfully. And they may be, if you look at retrospect though, we had done one in 64, they did theirs in 67, because this patient came back in the early 70s, 7 years after we had operated on him for other problems. We studied him, and Dennis studied him, and this graft was patent. Now, it caught everybody's attention, so we really studied it very thoroughly. And what had happened, this graft was patent and was retrograding up to the left main and down the circumflex. The right was totally occluded, as I previously mentioned. But you looked at this artery where we'd put it, and we were doing it with a beating heart, and at the toe of the graft, we had sort of pinched it. So it was not blocked, but it was not totally open 100%. So it had about a, I would say maybe a 60% stenosis at the toe, and which had caused ischemia to the distal part of his heart. But that's the first successful bypass graft ever described in the world, which was done in 1964. And, Roger, after that, the whole world exploded with this operations. God, there was more coronary operation bypasses and than were appendicitis.
Although you did your share of publication and research, your primary focus was always clinical work.
Yes.
In 2011, a major portion of an issue of the Methodist DeBakey Cardiovascular Journal was devoted to the large body, massive body of work that you had done clinically over the last 4 decades.
Yes.
There were 2 aspects to this body of work that were very impressive. The first was the sheer number of cases involved, and the second, the fact that you had careful follow-up and you knew what happened.
Yes.
There were some 60,000 total cases reported, with 30,000 being cardiac or vascular, excluding general surgical and thoracic cases.
Yes.
Let's concentrate on the peripheral vascular cases,
Okay.
which, you know, was always my primary interest. You had over 3,500 cerebrovascular cases with an overall mortality of 0.9, absolutely spectacular, falling to 0.3
Yes.
over the last decade.
Yes.
How did the use of the EEG and the patches help in this situation, Jimmy?
Well, you know, this has evolved over time, you know, and DeBakey was always a patch man. You know, he trained me to do cardiac endarterectomies, and he always felt that rather than a primary repair of that artery, when you repaired it primarily, you always sized it down some. So he always felt like that the patch was the appropriate thing to do for. And of course, he taught me, and I stuck with that concept that was the best thing to do. And I think over a period of time, studies showed that comparing the patch with the primary closure, the patch was more patent longer, with less recurrence of problems. And the cerebrovascular business came from a point where you were doing just clamping the artery, opening it up, putting a patch on it, and seeing what happened. And then, of course, you know, you had strokes. So the internal shunt evolved. The problem with the internal shunt, it was a good supplement to cerebrovascular surgery because you had flow continually. If you put this shunt in during the operation, you could take the material out of the artery, the plaque out of the artery. You could put your patch on or do whatever you want to do, and you had continuous flow. Now the problem was that sometimes these shunts, when you put them in, there'd be a plaque you might knock off, or you might have, when you put it in, you may have some debris in the proximal part of the artery that when you open it up, it flushed into the brain. So it was not without total complications, and so uncomplicated. So I first decided here in Houston to try the concept of electroencephalography. And there was a fellow here that ran the department, and he and I decided maybe that we'd try this, and we did. And it was a 12-lead EEG placed on the patient's head. And the anesthesia had to be proper for the electroencephalogram to work properly, so the anesthesiologist had to be taught what kind of anesthetic to give. But anyway, once that was done and the process became evident that we could, you know, you could do it with substantial accuracy of the EEG, then we begun doing that. And this was a procedure where that if during the operation we'd raise the blood pressure a little bit so that the collateral circulation from the opposite side would cross field, and if the EEG would change or slow or become flat, well then you would immediately put a shunt in. And generally it took, by the time you would take to put the shunt in and the time the EEG would come back to normal would be about the time it took you to put the shunt in, which would be a minute or two, maybe 3. But anyway, so this seemed to be a very practical thing to do, and the last probably couple of thousand or more cases that I've done here, I've used the EEG. It's become a very valuable tool for me. And I think, in essence, you can see that with a 0.3 morbidity to mortality, that the operation could be extended to very, very safe, beyond safe levels, you know, to do this operation.
I didn't mention that you did another 439 carotids along with other procedures.
Oh, yes.
Also, with abdominal aortic aneurysms, you did over 2,000
Yeah,
with a mortality of less than 2%
yeah.
over the last 3 decades, which is absolutely spectacular.
Yeah.
Another 1,000 grafts for aortic iliac disease, 1,300 lower extremity bypasses, and 300 visceral bypasses without a mortality.
Yes.
Now, during this time, your assistants and associates changed
Yeah.
many times.
Yes.
So
Every
you
4
were the
months.
only constant in this situation. So what were your secrets to success, Jimmy?
Perfection of doing what you're doing. You have to do everything precise, with very precision. Very precise. You do things precise. It's like painting a picture. If you're a good artist, you can paint a beautiful picture. If you're a bad artist, you don't look very good.
You think this was just reflection of the fact that you were such a gifted technician?
I think it's probably about 50%. You know, you got to have some brains too, a little bit, Roger.
Even a surgeon, right?
Even a surgeon, yeah.
Talk to us a minute, Jimmy, about your mentors.
Yes.
Who do you consider your primary mentors?
I have to give a lot of credit to a lot of different people, but if I wanted to say just one individual, I'd say my primary mentor that was my best friend and my best ally in my coming up here was Stanley Crawford.
Tell us about Dr. Crawford.
He was a Harvard graduate, you know, and he was an intellectual fellow and a very talented surgeon. He came here from Boston. DeBakey hired him. He was from Alabama. He wanted to get off the farm, and he didn't want to raise any cows or horses. And he hated horses and cows, so he wanted to be, he was a surgeon. And he was a very talented fella. He smoked a lot of Picayune cigarettes over the years to his detriment. But Stanley was a real innovator. Stanley could take an operation and he could make it better in his hands, and you could see it done anyplace else. You know, he was a superb technician. And Stanley Crawford, in the latter part of his tenure here, really revolutionized thoracoabdominal aneurysm repairs. He made it so that you could do the operation with some simplicity. Prior, you know, to his work, this was an operation that carried very high mortality rates, 50, 60%. Nobody wanted to do an operation. Nobody wanted to do an operation for that. It sent them someplace, sent them somewhere for somebody to do them. Most of them stayed home and died, you know. But he designed this this operation for, and he's got a book that he put out. He wrote Diseases of the Aorta, and he describes all of these basic concepts of his procedures of how he did these operations, thoracoabdominal aneurysms, and of course other aneurysms, you know, complicated other type of aneurysms. But this was really the revolution point in the beginnings of modern thoracoabdominal aneurysm repair. He established it.
Jimmy, take a moment to talk about your personal life. You married Roberta when you were in training.
Yes, I was a third-year medical student.
Now, how many children do you have now?
6.
And grandchildren?
13.
Wow. A real handful.
A lot of work, wasn't it?
Now, let's speak about your hobbies a little bit.
Yeah.
Your ranch.
Yes.
We would speaking about this last night, but you've got a small ranch that covers how many acres?
I think about 16,000 acres, Roger.
And how many cows do you have now?
Well, I run about 2,000 head.
You've also always been interested in hunting and fishing.
Yeah, I still do it.
Still
my
find time for
my
that.
favorite hunting is quail. The quail population is sort of dwindled, particularly in droughts. You know, there are not many quail. So this past year there wasn't many quail. I operated a fellow from Denver by the name of Hamilton, and Fred Hamilton developed the first of the wells in the North Sea. And Fred's got a plantation in Georgia, South Georgia, and called Horseshoe Plantation. And I operated him about 15 years ago, or maybe more now, and did a bypass on him, and he's done very well. And he invites me to his plantation to shoot birds. And he has a lot of birds, so we have a good time.
Also, one of your hobbies has been oil.
Yeah, I've dabbled with it.
Well, you've been a recognized expert in this area. Jimmy, how did this happen? How did you learn about the oil business?
My father was he drilled oil wells, you know, and he's a young man, and I don't know, I was sort of raised around the oil patch from time to time. I, you know, knew what it was, knew what they did, and I decided at some point in my life, you know, I was not going to be able to cut on people, and I needed some other occupation to do. And I figured this might be a good one to participate in. And so, probably 35 or more years ago, I started drilling oil wells with a fella in South Louisiana by the name of Bob McAdams. And we drilled a fair number of wells, but I never made any money out of them. They were not too good at wells, and you know, and they were pretty expensive little wells. And also about the time that I went in that business, the price of oil dropped. And I met this fella here in Houston because he wanted me to operate on him. I'd operated on a CEO of Brown Root operation, and his fellow wanted me to operate on him, and so I said, well, okay. I said, if that's what you decided, he said, I want the guy that operated on Herb Frensley. I said, well, you got him. And Joe Walter was his name, and Joe had developed Houston Oil Minerals, a very successful outfit. And about the time, just before I operated with Joe had some period of time, really, before I operated him, he had a heart attack. And it almost killed him, but he survived this thing, but he developed a big aneurysm the size of a grapefruit. And his ejection fraction was about 17%. He was also having angina. And so I operated Joe and took his aneurysm off and did 3 bypasses on him. And sure enough, he did excellent. And he did very well. And shortly after this operation, he had already made some decision that he wanted to sell Houston Oil Minerals. So he sold Houston Oil Minerals to Tenneco Corporation. I don't know where you know who Tenneco is, but anyway, Tenneco was a pretty big outfit, for a couple of $1 billion. And about his 7th day in the hospital here, he wanted to go and consummate this sale downtown. So I reluctantly let him go, and he went in and did this and came back to the hospital as a good boy, and so he finished his recovery, and he was going back into business, but he couldn't go into business for a period of time, which is about 6 months or so, I think, 6-8 months. And so anyway, I got talking to him, and I said, well, you're going back into business. I said, how about me doing a little bit of business with you? And he looked at me and he said, I don't do business with other people, just all people. But he said, "You, okay."
Well, that was the beginning of a great partnership.
It was. It was. He came back for a second operation. 7 years later, maybe 10 years later, he had another recurrence, and I operated him again. Did a redo bypass on him, and he went about another 7, 8, 10 years, and developed a cardiomyopathy, congestive heart failure, and he needed a transplant. So George Newton and I transplanted him. He lived another 7 years.
Spectacular.
Yeah, yeah.
Jimmy, to finish up this interview, I'd like to ask you some opinion questions. The first is, the merger of SVS and ISCVS, do you think that this has harmed international exchange, particularly to Houston?
I don't think it has, Roger. Honestly, I don't believe it has.
As you know, medical care has become a real political football, particularly now with Obamacare. Do you think we've lost our way? Is there any way that we can maintain leadership as far as the best medical care in the world, carrying these burdens?
Yeah, but it's going to have to be a lot of turning around the business. That's all I can tell you. It can. There's no question it can continue. But the way it's going right now, I see it is sliding south, Roger.
No question.
Way south, and very rapidly.
Several years ago, as you know, several of the leaders in vascular surgery were very interested in developing an independent board of vascular surgery, despite the fact that over half the membership of SVS favored an independent board. It failed. Why do you think this failed? Or do you think this is a bad idea that should have failed?
No, I don't think it was a bad idea. You know, as you know, there was a board, and you had to be qualified to be a member, a board certified in vascular surgery. And I thought that was not a bad idea because, you know, as a matter of fact, I was one of the first to take it. Stanley Crawford and Cooley and Morris and I were the first to take this exam. And it was not an easy exam either. Of course, made this exam made it pretty tough, but it was okay. And so you were boarded in the vascular surgery as far as the qualifications, but then they have their own standing is another deal. And I think that that the problem that I see and that I saw as it went along, and that there was discussions and cussings about it. It was I think it was a problem between the American Board of Surgery. They didn't want to.
No doubt about it.
They didn't want to do it, and they're a very powerful board, as you know.
Yes.
And so it just got left in the dust. Yeah.
Now, Jimmy, in these 60,000 cases we discussed, there were no mention of endovascular cases. What is your thoughts on endovascular surgery?
Let me say this, Roger. I've never been one to hold back.
No.
And when that first came to being, I designed a room, which is the first room designed in Methodist Hospital for endovascular procedures. And I think you were here. Were you not here when I designed? You were gone already when I designed this room. Anyway, it was a room that you could do angiography on, you know, and X-rays so you could see where the catheters were going. A table, And it was quite an expensive operation. And this room probably a little better than $1 million, you know, to design it. And I sort of wanted to see what I could do with this endovascular stuff, you know, as far as the angioplasties of the arteries, the femoral arteries, the iliac arteries, and whatever. And I tried it, and some of my results were, you know, not bad. You know, the iliacs, you get one, it'll stay open. The superficial femorals, they wouldn't stay open very long for me.
Or for anyone.
Well, I don't know about that, but I mean, that I see it, they don't stay open very long for anyone, as far as I can tell. You know, I mean, in my experience, just looking at them over the years, you know, the carotids, they seem to be okay, got some problems with that. The endovascular stuff, you know, these stents they put in the abdominal aorta, that's another approach. I've always said in my own mind that if you got a healthy patient and they can tolerate an anesthetic, open operation is better. This is a industry-driven deal with endovascular surgery at the moment. All these major companies make a hell of a lot of money out of these devices that they make. And it is successful, I must say. I mean, I've looked at a lot of them over the time, and it does work. And in some areas it works very good. Some areas it don't work very good. You know, open surgery is still a very viable alternative.
Absolutely.
I would say, without any doubt, I mean, if you want good long-term results, you get a good open operation, you got the best of ever. If you want a operation that might work for a while or a long time, and you take your endovascular operation. The only problem is that these endovascular operations are really money gathering deals. I mean, you do an endovascular operation and put a stent in the abdominal aorta, you got to follow it every 4, 5, 6 months. Money.
Very expensive.
It's going to break the country.
As a last question for today, what is your advice to young surgeons?
Well, my advice to young surgeons: if you really want to be a surgeon, you better like what you're doing. It's hard work. Yeah, it's hard work, but it's very satisfying. I've had a very satisfied life. I wouldn't do anything else ever if I had to do it over again. Do exactly what I've done.
Jimmy, thank you for this
Yes, sir.
time.
My pleasure.
Thank you so much.